The drive through the winding roads of the Scottish Highlands was treacherous enough, but the heavy fog rolling over the moors made it feel like I was descending into another world entirely. My name is Arthur, and I work as a specialized network architect, setting up high-speed internet and smart systems for remote luxury properties. Most of the time, it's a quiet, straightforward job, but my assignment at Blackwood Manor, a sprawling, isolated estate near Inverness, still haunts me to this day. The manor had recently been purchased by a young tech entrepreneur named Mr. Sterling, who wanted the 19th century stone fortress dragged into the modern age. When I arrived, he greeted me at the massive oak doors, looking stressed and exhausted. He explained that he was completely alone on the property, as the renovation crew wouldn't arrive until the following week. He handed me a master ring of heavy iron keys and pointed me toward the cellar door. My job was to install the main server rack in the deepest part of the sub-basement, where the temperature was naturally regulated. I gathered my heavy tool bags and made my way down the narrow, spiraling stone staircase. The air grew significantly colder with every step, smelling of wet earth, old masonry, and something else I couldn't quite place, like dried lavender and decaying paper. The sub-basement was massive, a labyrinth of arched brick ceilings and dusty wine racks that stretched into the shadows. I set up my portable work lights, casting long, distorted shadows against the damp walls, and got to work. For the first 2 hours, the only sound was the hum of my portable generator and the rhythmic clipping of wires. But then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sudden noise, but rather a profound, suffocating drop in the ambient temperature. My breath began to materialize in small, white clouds before my face. I paused my work, reaching for my thermos of hot coffee, when I heard the slow, deliberate scraping of footsteps on the stone floor behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. Standing just beyond the halo of my work light was an elderly man. He was tall and painfully thin, dressed in a heavy tweed suit that looked decades out of fashion, complete with a tarnished silver pocket watch chain draped across his waistcoat. "You are disturbing the foundations," he said. His voice was incredibly deep, carrying a strange, resonant echo, as if he were speaking from inside a cavern. I took a step back, instinctively clutching my heavy wrench. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone else was down here. Mr. Sterling said he was alone. Are you the groundskeeper?" The old man didn't blink. His eyes were entirely shadowed by the heavy brow of his face, but I could feel a piercing, icy gaze locked onto me. "My name is Alistair," he whispered, taking one slow step forward. "I have tended to the archives of Blackwood for nearly a century. You must not drill into the northern wall. The structural integrity is delicate. It keeps things separated." A shiver ran violently down my spine. There was something fundamentally wrong with his presence. He didn't cast a shadow against the brickwork, and the smell of dried lavender was now overwhelmingly strong, masking the scent of ozone and dust. "Oh, okay," I stammered, unable to tear my eyes away from him. "I'll route the cables along the ceiling instead. No drilling on the north wall. Understood?" Alistair gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "See that you do, Arthur," he murmured. My blood ran entirely cold. I hadn't told him my name. I didn't wear a name tag. Before I could ask how he knew, the portable work light violently flickered, plunging the cellar into absolute pitch-black darkness for 3 agonizing seconds. I fumbled frantically for the flashlight on my belt, clicking it on and sweeping the brilliant white beam across the room. Alistair was gone. There were no footsteps retreating up the stairs, no sound of a door closing, just the suffocating silence of the underground. I didn't wait to finish the cable management. I threw my tools into the bag with shaking hands, leaving the heavy spool of fiber optic wire behind, and sprinted up the spiraling stone stairs, taking them two at a time. I burst through the cellar door into the main hallway, gasping for air, my clothes soaked in a cold sweat. Mr. Sterling was standing in the foyer, looking at me with a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Is everything all right down there?" he asked, putting down his tablet. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, but your archivist, Alistair, he startled me down there. He warned me not to drill into the north wall. I think he's upset about the renovations." Mr. Sterling's expression shifted from annoyance to complete bewilderment. The color slowly drained from his face. "Arthur," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I told you when you arrived. I am the only living soul within 10 miles of this estate. There is no archivist." "He was right there," I insisted, my voice rising in panic. "Tall, old tweed suit, said his name was Alistair." Mr. Sterling slowly walked over to a dusty portrait leaning against the wall, waiting to be hung. He turned it around. It was a faded black and white photograph of a man standing in front of the manor. He was tall, painfully thin, wearing the exact same tweed suit and silver pocket watch chain. "This is Alistair Blackwood," Mr. Sterling whispered, staring at the photo. "He built this manor in 1892. He died in the cellar 110 years ago, when the northern wall collapsed on top of him." I didn't say another word. I walked out the front doors, got into my van, and drove away from Blackwood Manor. I left my tools, I left the cables, and I never went back. The locals in the small town of Ashwood, Vermont, rarely spoke about the old Hawthorne house. It sat at the end of a long, overgrown dirt road, miles away from the nearest neighbor. I had rented the property for 6 months, hoping the absolute isolation would help me finish the illustrations for a new graphic novel. My name is Elias, and I've always preferred the quiet. But the silence in that house was something entirely different. It was heavy. It felt like the house was holding its breath. The first 3 days were incredibly productive. I set up my drafting table in the main parlor, facing the large bay windows that looked out into the dense pine forest. The house was drafty, filled with the typical creaks and groans of a building that had stood for over a century. But on the 4th night, the mundane noises shifted into something deliberate. It started around 2 in the morning. I was wide awake, sketching under the warm glow of my desk lamp, when I heard a distinct sound coming from the floor directly above me. It sounded like a heavy, wooden chair being slowly dragged across the hardwood floor. The agonizing scrape echoed down the grand staircase. I froze, my pen hovering over the paper. The previous owner had assured me the house was fully furnished, but the 2nd floor was supposed to be completely empty, locked up to keep the heating bill down. I convinced myself it was just the wind, or the old woods settling. I went back to my work, but 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't the quick, light steps of an animal. They were slow, heavy, and incredibly rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. Pacing back and forth, directly above my ceiling. My heart began to race. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron fireplace poker from the hearth and slowly made my way toward the staircase. Every step I took seemed deafeningly loud in the dead of night. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. My breath plumed into the air, a stark white mist against the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone up there? I'm armed, and I've already called the police." A lie, but I hoped it would be enough to scare off any drifters. The pacing stopped immediately. Absolute, suffocating silence fell over the house. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my grip white-knuckled on the iron poker. When nothing happened, I began to ascend the stairs. The ancient wood protested under my weight, groaning loudly. When I reached the landing, I peered down the long, narrow hallway. The moonlight was streaming through a small window at the very end, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. There was nothing there. All the doors to the upstairs bedrooms were tightly shut. I let out a long, shaky breath, feeling a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over me. My imagination was just getting the better of me. I turned around to head back down, but as my hand brushed against the banister, I heard a soft, wet sound from behind me, like bare feet stepping on damp wood. I slowly turned my head. Standing at the far end of the hallway, silhouetted against the pale moonlight, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its head nearly grazing the low ceiling. It didn't look human. The proportions were entirely wrong. The arms hung limply at its sides, extending far past where its knees should be. It was nothing more than an absolute void of darkness, darker than the unlit corners of the hallway. It seemed to absorb the light around it. I was completely paralyzed. Every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I watched in sheer horror as the shadow began to glide forward. It didn't walk. It just smoothly drifted over the floorboards, accompanied by that awful, wet, squelching sound. The air grew so freezing cold that my skin began to ache. As it drew closer, the smell hit me. It was the overwhelming stench of stagnant water, rotting wood, and old copper. I finally managed to break the paralysis, stumbling backward down the stairs. I tripped over my own feet, tumbling the last few steps and hitting the hardwood floor of the foyer hard. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my shoulder, and looked back up the staircase. The figure was standing at the top of the landing, staring down at me. It had no face, no discernible features whatsoever, but I could feel a palpable, ancient malice radiating from it. The hostility was so intense it made my eyes water. It slowly raised one of its impossibly long, elongated arms, pointing a shadowy finger directly at me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I dropped the iron poker, turned, and bolted for the front door. I didn't grab my keys, my wallet, or my phone. I burst out into the freezing night air and ran blindly down the dirt road until my lungs burned and I reached the main highway. I flagged down a passing trucker, babbling incoherently about someone in my house. The local police investigated the property the next morning. They found the front door wide open, my drawings scattered across the parlor floor. But the upstairs was completely undisturbed. All the doors were still locked. A layer of thick, unbroken dust covered the floorboards. There were no footprints, no dragged chairs, nothing. I never went back to Ashwood. I had my belongings packed and shipped to me by a moving company. I still don't know what was in that house with me, but I know one thing for certain. It had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and it did not want me there. The coastal winds of Cape Disappointment, Washington, always had a way of sounding like human voices. My name is Maya, and during my senior year of college, I took a weekend babysitting job to pay for my textbooks. The Gallagher House was a massive, modern glass and steel structure, built right on the edge of a jagged cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was gorgeous during the day, but terrifyingly isolated at night. Mrs. Gallagher was a wealthy real estate developer, a single mother who rarely had a night off. She was attending a charity gala down in Astoria, leaving me to watch her 4-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a sweet, quiet kid, prone to sleepwalking, so Mrs. Gallagher was incredibly strict about keeping all the doors locked and the security system armed before the sun went down. By 8 p.m., Leo was fast asleep in his nursery on the second floor. I armed the perimeter alarm, double-checked the heavy deadbolts, and settled onto the living room sofa with my laptop and the baby monitor. Outside, a massive Pacific storm was rolling in. The rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the wind howled through the steel framework of the house. It was around 11:30 p.m. when the baby monitor crackled to life. It was just a burst of static at first, breaking the rhythm of the storm outside. I leaned forward, turning up the volume. Through the hiss of the speaker, I heard the creak of the nursery floorboards. Then, I heard a voice. "Hush now, little Leo. Mommy is right here." The voice was incredibly soft, almost a whisper, but it was undeniably Mrs. Gallagher's voice. She was humming a slow, off-key lullaby. I smiled, assuming she had come home early and bypassed the front door to avoid waking him. I picked up my phone to send her a quick text, asking if she wanted me to make her some tea. As the screen lit up, my blood turned to absolute ice.
There was a text message sitting on my lock screen, received less than 2 minutes ago. It was from Mrs. Gallagher. It read, "The bridge is flooded out. The police are turning cars around. I'm stuck at a hotel in Astoria for the night. Is Leo okay?" I stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what I was reading. If Mrs. Gallagher was trapped across the river, who was singing to Leo? I looked back at the baby monitor. The humming continued, slow, rhythmic, and entirely unnatural. It lacked emotion. It sounded like a recording being played at the wrong speed. Panic seized my chest. I grabbed the heavy brass fire poker from the hearth, my hands shaking violently. I crept toward the main staircase, trying to keep my footsteps completely silent. The storm outside raged on, masking the sound of my ragged breathing. As I reached the second-floor landing, the temperature dropped dramatically. The air felt thick, heavy with the smell of wet copper and ocean brine. The door to Leo's nursery was slightly ajar. The humming had stopped. I pressed my back against the wall, gripping the fire poker tightly, and slowly nudged the door open with my foot. The room was bathed in the pale green glow of a turtle-shaped nightlight. Leo was sound asleep in his bed, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. But leaning over his crib was a tall, unnaturally thin figure. She was wearing the exact same crimson evening gown Mrs. Gallagher had left the house in. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, completely obscuring her face. "Hey," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure froze. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the woman turned her head to look at me. Her face was a nightmare. It looked like Mrs. Gallagher, but the features were melting, stretched and distorted like wet clay slipping off a skull. Her eyes were completely black, void of any white, staring at me with a cold, predatory emptiness. She opened her mouth, unhinging her jaw far wider than any human could, and let out a sound that I will never forget. It wasn't a scream, it was a perfect, flawless imitation of my own voice, pleading for help. I didn't think. I lunged forward, grabbing Leo from the mattress, completely ignoring the heavy blanket. The creature recoiled, hissing like static from a broken radio. I sprinted out of the room, clutching the crying child to my chest. I threw myself down the stairs, nearly breaking my ankle on the final step. I didn't bother trying to disarm the security system. I smashed through the front door, setting off the blaring sirens, and ran out into the freezing torrential rain. I locked myself inside my car,
dialing 911 with trembling fingers, watching the dark windows of the house. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They searched the entire property, top to bottom. The doors were all perfectly locked. The windows were sealed. There was absolutely no sign of a break-in, and no one else inside the house. But right next to Leo's crib, they found a puddle of freezing seawater and a single, long strand of dark hair. I never babysat again, and I still sleep with the lights on.
The vast, unending expanse of Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada, has always been my sanctuary. My name is Julian, and I've been backcountry camping since I was a teenager. I usually stick to the marked portage routes, the paths worn down by thousands of summer tourists. But last October, the craving for true, absolute isolation took hold of me. I wanted to be somewhere no human had stepped in decades. I parked my truck at the northernmost access point and hiked 15 miles entirely off-trail, navigating by compass and topographical map. I pushed deep into a sector of ancient, old-growth pine, where the canopy was so impossibly thick it blocked out the sun even at high noon. It was just me and my golden retriever, Barnaby. He's a seasoned trail dog, fearless, obedient, and fiercely loyal. But what we found waiting for us out there in the deep woods broke both of us forever. We finally stopped to set up camp in a small circular clearing near a stagnant, unnamed lake. The water was undisturbed and pitch black, reflecting the dying, bruised light of the late autumn afternoon. The air was incredibly still. As the sun dipped below the jagged tree line, the temperature plummeted instantly, as if a freezer door had been left open. I quickly built a roaring fire, the crackle of dry pine providing a comforting rhythm while I cooked some dehydrated stew over the flames. Barnaby lay nearby, happily chewing on a thick branch. Everything felt perfectly normal, serene even, until the sun completely vanished from the sky. Usually, the deep woods come alive at night. You hear the constant rhythmic chirp of crickets, the mournful hoot of a distant owl, the sudden rustle of small game moving through the dry underbrush. But that night, the silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating, unnatural quiet, as if the entire forest was collectively holding its breath in anticipation. Barnaby noticed the shift before I did. He dropped his branch, his ear suddenly pinned flat against his skull. He stood up slowly, the fur along his spine standing straight up, and he began to emit a low, continuous, vibrating growl deep from within his chest. I threw another heavy log onto the fire, desperately trying to shake off the sudden icy feeling of dread washing over me. "It's just a bear, buddy," I whispered to him, trying to sound confident, though I didn't believe it myself. Bears are noisy, clumsy creatures. Whatever was out there in the dark wasn't making a single sound. Then, the smell rolled into the campsite. It wasn't the musky, damp scent of a wild animal. It smelled overwhelmingly like burning hair, ozone, and old oxidized copper. It was so potent it made my stomach churn. Barnaby retreated backward until his rear was pressed tightly against the fabric of our tent, refusing to break his gaze from the tree line. I reached into my pack and pulled out my heavy hunting knife, my knuckles turning stark white as I gripped the rubberized handle. I stood up, slowly turning in a circle to scan the pitch-black woods just beyond the protective glow of the fire. Suddenly, the bright flames of my campfire violently flickered and dimmed to a low crawl, not from a gust of wind, but as if all the oxygen had been momentarily sucked from the clearing. When the flame stabilized and flared back up, I saw it. Standing just outside the ring of orange light, partially obscured by the thick, rotting trunk of a dead pine, was a figure. It was incredibly tall, standing perhaps 7 or 8 feet high, but impossibly, sickly thin.
Its skin was the pale, sickly color of wet ash, completely hairless, pulling so tightly over its skeletal frame that I could see the outline of every bone. But the most terrifying part were its limbs. They were disproportionately long, extending far past its knees, ending in sharp, multi-jointed fingers that twitched and curled erratically in the dark. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless expanse of pale, taut skin where its eyes, nose, and mouth should be. Yet, I could feel a heavy, predatory gaze locked directly onto me. I was completely frozen, entirely paralyzed by a primal, suffocating terror that rooted my boots to the soil. Then, the creature slowly opened a jagged, vertical slit in the dead center of its face and made a sound. It wasn't a roar or an animalistic shriek. It was the exact, perfect sound of my own mother's voice, calling my name. "Julian, come here into the dark." The voice was completely flat, completely devoid of any human emotion, a flawless, mechanical mimicry playing back to lure me in. Barnaby finally broke, letting out a terrified, high-pitched whimper and diving headfirst into the safety of the tent. That sudden movement broke my paralysis. I backed away agonizingly slowly, never breaking my gaze from the pale entity until I was fully inside the tent. I zipped the heavy canvas shut with violently shaking hands, clutching my knife and holding Barnaby tight against my chest. We sat there in absolute, terrifying darkness for 8 agonizing hours. I didn't sleep a single second. We could hear it, pacing in slow, deliberate circles around the outside of the tent, its heavy, unnatural footsteps snapping large twigs and crushing the dry autumn leaves. It continuously whispered my name in my mother's voice, over and over again, all night long, occasionally dragging its sharp fingers against the thin nylon fabric of the tent. As the first pale light of dawn finally broke through the canvas, the footsteps abruptly stopped. The deafening silence returned. I didn't wait to pack my expensive gear. I didn't bother to put out the smoldering fire. I simply grabbed Barnaby's leash, cut a massive slit through the back wall of the tent with my knife, and ran the 15 miles back to my truck without ever looking back over my shoulder. The quiet suburb of Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, was supposed to be my sanctuary. My name is David, and after a grueling, complicated divorce, I bought a small, single-story house at the very end of a dead-end street. The neighborhood was idyllic, filled with young families, pristine sidewalks, and manicured lawns. But my immediate neighbor to the left was a stark, unsettling exception. His name was Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy was a fiercely reclusive man in his late 80s. His property was heavily overgrown, a wild, chaotic tangle of dead ivy and ancient oak trees, hidden behind a massive 8-foot privacy fence built from rotting cedar planks. The only time I ever saw him was deep in the middle of the night. I suffer from terrible insomnia, and I would often sit on my back porch smoking a cigarette at 2 or 3 in the morning. Through the warped gaps in the wooden fence, I could see the pale, sickly beam of a heavy flashlight moving erratically around his backyard. I would hear the distinct, rhythmic, metallic snip, snip, snip of heavy, rusted gardening shears. He was always out there in the freezing dark, methodically tending to a garden I could never fully see. We never spoke a single word to each other. He kept strictly to his shadows, and I kept to mine. That all changed on a freezing Tuesday morning in late November. I woke up to the violent, flashing red and blue lights of an ambulance reflecting through my bedroom blinds. I walked out to my frost-covered front lawn, clutching a hot mug of coffee, and watched as 2 paramedics wheeled a heavy metal stretcher out of Mr. Abernathy's front door. A thick black sheet covered the body entirely. The local police officer on the scene told me that the old man had suffered a massive heart attack, likely several days prior. He had absolutely no next of kin, no surviving family, no friends to claim the property. The house was officially locked up and abandoned, pending a lengthy legal probate process by the city. The electricity was completely shut off at the main breaker, and heavy brass padlocks were placed on the front and back doors by the authorities. For the first week, the total silence next door was actually quite peaceful. But on the 8th night after his rotting body was taken away, the impossible began to happen. I was sitting on my back porch, nursing a glass of cheap bourbon at around 1 a.m. The air was bitterly cold, and a heavy, sparkling frost had settled over the dead grass. I was staring blankly at the rotting cedar fence when I heard a sound that made my blood run entirely cold. Snip, snip, snip. It was the unmistakable, agonizing, metallic grinding of Mr. Abernathy's rusted gardening shears. The sound was coming from directly behind the fence, deep within the dead man's overgrown backyard. I froze, my breath catching painfully in my throat. I told myself it was just a stray animal, maybe a raccoon or a feral cat rummaging through the thick brush. But the rhythm was far too deliberate, too calculated. It was a methodical, continuous trimming of thick branches. Then, a pale yellow light flickered on. It was a heavy flashlight beam, cutting through the dense, freezing fog, casting long, twisted, monstrous shadows of dead branches against the wooden planks. The beam of light bobbed up and down, moving slowly along the fence line, accompanied by the heavy, dragging, exhausted footsteps of someone walking through the frosted dead leaves. I convinced myself that a desperate squatter had broken into the abandoned property. I grabbed my phone, rushed back inside, and dialed the local police dispatcher. I told them someone was trespassing next door with a flashlight in the dead of night. They promised to send a patrol car immediately to secure the perimeter. I didn't turn on any of my interior lights. I crept quietly up to my second-floor guest bedroom window, which offered a slight, elevated angle looking down into Mr. Abernathy's backyard. The flashlight beam was still moving erratically, but the fog was far too thick to see who or what was holding it. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled silently down the street, turning off its headlights as it parked to maintain the element of surprise. 2 officers got out, drawing their heavy tactical flashlights, and made their way around the side of the decaying house. I watched from the window as they easily hopped the rotting wooden fence, landing with a heavy thud in the overgrown weeds. The exact moment their heavy boots hit the ground, the yellow flashlight beam in the yard instantly snapped off. The metallic snipping sound ceased completely. The backyard was immediately plunged into absolute pitch-black silence. I watched nervously as the 2 officers swept their brilliant white lights back and forth across the yard. They checked the heavy padlock on the back door. It was still perfectly intact, coated in frost. They checked the ground floor windows, all firmly locked from the inside. After 20 minutes of thoroughly searching every inch of the property, they climbed back over the fence and knocked heavily on my front door. "There's absolutely nobody back there, sir," the older officer said, looking visibly annoyed by the cold. "The perimeter is completely secure, no footprints in the frost, no signs of forced entry. You probably just heard a stray dog knocking over some old tools in the wind." I thanked them, feeling incredibly foolish and embarrassed, and apologized profusely for wasting their time. I locked my doors, went back up to my bedroom, and eventually managed to fall into a fitful, uneasy sleep, filled with nightmares of overgrown thorns. The next morning, the heavy fog had finally cleared, revealing a bright, crisp autumn day. I decided to rake the dead leaves in my own backyard to clear my head.
As I gathered the heavy piles near the property line, my rake caught sharply on something near the base of the rotting cedar fence. I knelt down in the freezing dirt to untangle it. There, right at the bottom edge of the fence, where the rotting wood met the frozen earth, was a small, freshly dug hole. It looked like an animal burrow, but it was too perfectly round, too neat. I leaned in, peering through a large, warped gap in the wooden planks, looking directly into Mr. Abernathy's yard in the harsh, revealing broad daylight. My stomach violently dropped. The overgrown weeds hadn't been touched at all, but right in the dead center of the yard, perfectly illuminated by the morning sun, was a massive, rectangular patch of freshly turned, dark brown earth. It was exactly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and standing perfectly upright, buried deeply blade first into the center of the loose dirt, were a pair of heavy, rusted gardening shears. I packed a single suitcase and left that afternoon. I put the house on the market 3 days later, taking a massive financial loss just to be rid of it. I couldn't spend another single night listening to the dark, because whatever was digging over there wasn't planting flowers. It was preparing a bed. The historic district of Beacon Hill in Boston is known for its beautiful, ivy-covered brownstones and narrow cobblestone streets. My name is Clara, and when I found a spacious top-floor apartment overlooking the Charles River for half the average market rent, I thought I had won the lottery. The landlord, a nervous, fidgety man named Mr. Harrison, rushed through the lease agreement. He handed me the heavy brass keys without ever making eye contact, and practically sprinted down the stairs the moment the paperwork was signed. I should have recognized the glaring red flags, but I was just a broke graduate student, desperate for a quiet place to study. The architecture was stunning, featuring exposed brick walls, antique brass fixtures, and original hardwood floors that groaned under the lightest footstep. The first 3 days were perfectly normal. I spent my time unpacking heavy boxes, organizing my art supplies, and enjoying the deep, resonant silence of the old building. The isolation felt productive at first, but on the 4th morning, the subtle, terrifying anomalies began. I have always been a creature of strict habit. Every evening, without fail, I placed my apartment keys, my wallet, and my glasses on the small wooden console table right by the front door. But when I woke up on Thursday, my keys were gone. I searched the entire apartment in a frantic panic, checking the pockets of my coats and digging through the bottom of my purse. I finally found them, perfectly centered on the porcelain pedestal of the bathroom sink. It was strange, but I chalked it up to exhaustion and severe sleep deprivation. The next day, the kitchen began to act up. I poured myself a hot cup of coffee, setting the heavy ceramic mug down on the granite island while I turned around to grab the cream from the refrigerator. I was facing away for no more than 3 seconds. When I turned back, the mug had been moved.
It was now resting at the very edge of the counter, dangerously close to falling off and shattering on the tile. A thin trail of spilled, steaming coffee connected its original spot to where it now sat. I lived completely alone. The doors were heavily deadbolted from the inside. There were no drafts strong enough to push a heavy, full mug across a flat stone surface. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted from welcoming to deeply hostile. A cold, creeping sense of dread slowly settled into my stomach and refused to leave. I began to feel an oppressive, heavy weight in the air, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure right before a violent thunderstorm. There were distinct cold spots in the narrow hallway, pockets of freezing air that made my breath visible in the middle of September. I constantly felt the prickling sensation of unseen eyes burning into the back of my neck, especially when I was washing my face in the bathroom mirror. By the second week, the unseen entity stopped being subtle. It wanted me to know it was there, and it wanted me to be afraid. I was sitting on my living room rug, surrounded by heavy textbooks, when I heard a distinct, loud click from the kitchen. I froze, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I slowly stood up, creeping around the corner to investigate. Every single cabinet door in the kitchen, upper and lower, was standing wide open. The drawers were pulled out to their absolute maximum extension and stacked in a precarious, physically impossible tower in the dead center of the linoleum floor were all of my kitchen knives. They were balanced point to point, a jagged metal spine rising perfectly straight toward the ceiling. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed me. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold my phone. I retreated into my bedroom, dragging my heavy oak dresser across the hardwood floor to barricade the door. I sat on the edge of the mattress, clutching a heavy metal flashlight, listening to the terrifying symphony echoing from the other side of the drywall. It sounded like a team of invisible, furious movers tearing the apartment apart. I heard the sickening screech of heavy wooden furniture being dragged across the floorboards, the sharp, violent shattering of glass, the rhythmic, echoing thud of thick books being violently thrown against the walls, and underneath it all, a low, wet, guttural breathing that seemed to seep right beneath the crack of my bedroom door. I didn't sleep. I didn't move a single muscle. I just waited for the morning sun to finally pierce through the curtains. When the absolute silence finally returned, and the golden morning light filled the room, I carefully pushed the dresser away and opened my bedroom door. The living room was completely unrecognizable. The heavy velvet sofa had been flipped entirely upside down. My heavy oak dining table was propped up vertically against the far window, blocking out the view. And every single book I owned, hundreds of them, were stacked into a spiraling structural archway leading directly to the front door. I didn't pack a single box. I didn't call the landlord. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my heavy winter coat, and I carefully ducked under the impossible archway of books. As my hand touched the cold brass of the front doorknob, a single, freezing breath grazed the back of my neck, carrying the faint, sickening scent of sulfur and old, rotting dust. "Next time," a raspy, disembodied voice whispered directly into my right ear, "don't lock the door." I threw myself into the hallway and ran down the 3 flights of stairs, never returning for my deposit or my belongings. I moved back to my hometown in Ohio the very next week. The local police eventually went in to retrieve my laptop, but they absolutely refused to tell me exactly what they found inside. I try not to think about it anymore, but sometimes, when I place my keys on the table at night, I sit and watch them for hours in the dark, just to make sure they don't move. Savannah, Georgia, is world-renowned for its weeping willow trees draped in heavy Spanish moss, and its stunning, perfectly preserved historic charm. But those picturesque cobblestone streets also hide some of the darkest, most deeply buried secrets in the American South. My name is Thomas, and I work as an architectural photographer. I specialize in shooting grand 19th-century properties just before they undergo massive, multi-million-dollar historical renovations. Most of these old plantation houses are just dusty, sad shells, left to rot by families who simply couldn't afford the exorbitant upkeep. But the Mercer Hayes house sitting isolated on the very edge of the historic district, was entirely different. The sprawling property had been completely abandoned, boarded up and left to decay since the late 1980s. When I unlocked the heavy, rusted iron gate, the massive hinges screamed in protest, echoing down the empty street. The front yard was a chaotic jungle of overgrown, dead weeds, and the house itself loomed against the gray sky like a decaying stone monument. The real estate agent absolutely refused to come inside with me. She tossed me the heavy ring of brass keys, rolled up her window, and waited safely in her locked car. As I stepped through the massive double mahogany doors, the atmosphere instantly shifted. The air inside felt incredibly thick, heavy, and oppressive. It smelled strongly of dry rot, ancient peeling wallpaper, and an undeniable, sharp, metallic scent of old copper. The silence inside the house was absolute, completely swallowing the ambient sounds of the city traffic outside. It felt like stepping into a vacuum. I set up my heavy aluminum tripod in the grand foyer, carefully adjusting my camera settings to capture the magnificent, sweeping spiral staircase that led into the darkness of the second floor. I was hyper-focused on adjusting the exposure ring on my lens when I first heard it.
It was incredibly faint, slipping quietly through the suffocating, dusty silence of the house. A soft, melodic, unmistakable giggle. It sounded exactly like a little girl, echoing down from somewhere deep within the second floor. I froze instantly, my finger hovering nervously over the shutter button. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly in the vast empty space. "The property is permanently closed. You really shouldn't be in here." There was no answer, just the heavy, judgmental silence of the old house. I grabbed my heavy metal flashlight from my equipment bag, abandoning my expensive camera, and slowly began to climb the grand staircase. Every single wooden step groaned violently under my weight, sounding like gunshots in the quiet. As I reached the upper landing, the ambient temperature absolutely plummeted. The sudden cold was aggressive. I could clearly see my breath forming small, rapid white clouds in the bright beam of my flashlight. The long, narrow hallway was lined with tightly closed doors. I shined my light down at the floorboards. The thick, gray layer of dust was completely undisturbed. There were absolutely no footprints, no signs of squatters or trespassing kids. I was just about to turn around, desperately convincing myself it was just a strange draft echoing in the old brick chimneys, when a small, solid object suddenly skittered out from under the very last door on the left. It slid smoothly across the hardwood floor, stopping dead right at the tip of my leather boot. I shined my light down. It was a faded wooden alphabet block. The letter A was painted in chipped, peeling red paint. The wood was cold to the touch. Before my brain could process what I was looking at, the terrifying laughter erupted again. But this time, it wasn't just one single child. It was the chaotic, overwhelming sound of 3 or 4 children, giggling wildly, their heavy footsteps running in rapid, frantic circles right inside that closed room. It sounded like a joyful, energetic game of tag. The happy, playful sounds were absolutely terrifying against the backdrop of that decaying, empty nightmare. I gripped the cold, tarnished brass doorknob, my hand shaking so violently I could barely turn it, and shoved the heavy door open. The room was the old nursery. The peeling, water-damaged wallpaper was covered in a faded pattern of pale blue clouds. Right in the dead center of the room sat a massive, antique wooden rocking horse, and it was rocking violently back and forth. The rusty metal springs were groaning and shrieking under the weight of a heavy, unseen rider.
The air inside the nursery was freezing, and the sickening smell of ozone and stagnant water was suffocating. Suddenly, the frantic laughter stopped dead. Complete, terrifying silence crashed down. The antique rocking horse froze instantly, mid-swing, defying the laws of physics. Out of the pitch-black, shadow-drenched corner of the nursery, a child's voice whispered. But this time, it wasn't playful. It was deep, distorted, and filled with a pure, ancient, predatory malice. "Hide and seek," the voice hissed, the freezing breath brushing directly against my ear. I didn't turn around to look. I threw myself backward out of the doorway. I tumbled blindly down the grand staircase, completely ignoring the agonizing, sharp pain in my ribs as I hit the floor. I bolted out the front door and sprinted down the driveway. I left my expensive camera. I left the tripod. I left my camera bag. The real estate agent threw the car in reverse and peeled out of the driveway the second I slammed my door shut, not even asking what happened. I found out months later that the Mercer Hayes house had briefly served as an unregistered orphanage in the winter of 1924. 4 young children vanished from that exact third-floor bedroom in a single freezing night. They were never found.
And whatever took them is clearly still playing with them in the dark. The winters in Anchorage, Alaska, are incredibly unforgiving. The sun barely rises, and the nights stretch out into an endless, suffocating darkness that heavily blankets the city. My name is Sarah, and 10 years ago, I worked as a registered nurse at St. Jude's Medical Center. It was a massive, brutalist concrete building constructed in the 1960s, a place that always felt slightly too cold, no matter how high they turned up the ancient heating system. I requested the graveyard shift, from midnight to 8 in the morning, because it was usually quiet. But the silence on the 4th floor, the palliative care ward, was a different kind of quiet. It was the heavy, expectant silence of waiting for the inevitable. The 4th floor was a single, incredibly long hallway lined with private rooms. At night, they dimmed the overhead fluorescent tubes, leaving the corridor bathed in a sickly, pale yellow twilight. Most of our patients were heavily sedated, completely bedridden, just waiting out their final days in the sterile quiet. The only consistent sounds were the rhythmic mechanical hissing of oxygen concentrators and the slow, steady beeps of the heart monitors. It was 3:15 a.m. on a deeply frozen Tuesday morning. Outside, a massive blizzard was violently battering the thick, reinforced glass of the windows. I was sitting alone at the nurse's station, updating medical charts under the glow of a small desk lamp, when a sudden, jarring sound broke the silence. It was the electronic chime of a patient call button. I looked up at the digital display board above the desk. The red numbers flashed brightly in the dim light. Room 418. It was located at the absolute farthest end of the long corridor. The room belonged to Mr. Callahan, a frail 90-year-old man who had been completely unresponsive and in a deep coma for 3 days. It was physically impossible for him to have pressed the heavy plastic button clipped to his bed rail. I assumed the heavy clip had simply slipped off the bed and hit the floor, triggering the alarm. I grabbed my stethoscope, stood up, and began the long walk down the dim hallway. About halfway down, the atmosphere abruptly shifted. The ambient temperature, which was already quite cool, plummeted so violently and suddenly that I physically gasped. The air felt incredibly thick, almost like trying to walk through freezing water. A profound, instinctual sense of dread began to crawl up the back of my neck, making the hairs on my arms stand straight up.
The overhead fluorescent lights directly above me began to flicker violently, buzzing with an angry, aggressive electrical hum. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I looked down the long corridor toward room 418. Standing perfectly still in the middle of the hallway, directly outside Mr. Callahan's closed door, was a figure. At first, my exhausted brain tried to rationalize it. I thought it was a visiting family member who had wandered out of the room, but the proportions were completely, horrifyingly wrong. The figure was impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing against the dropped ceiling panels. It didn't look like a solid person. It looked like a dense, three-dimensional void, an absolute absence of light that seemed to actively absorb the pale yellow glow of the hallway. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothing, just a towering, shifting silhouette of pure, suffocating darkness. I couldn't move. My feet were entirely glued to the linoleum floor. I was completely paralyzed by a wave of raw, primal terror. The entity slowly turned its featureless head toward me. I couldn't see any eyes, but I could feel a heavy, crushing, predatory gaze locking directly onto me. The air grew so incredibly cold that my breath began to form thick white clouds in the hallway. The sickly smell of ozone,
mixed with the unmistakable stench of rotting earth and stagnant water, violently hit my senses. Then, the creature didn't walk. It didn't take a single step. It simply glided, drifting smoothly and silently across the floor. It moved toward the heavy wooden door of room 418, and instead of opening it, the pitch-black shadow seamlessly slipped straight through the solid wood, completely vanishing into the patient's room. The exact moment the entity disappeared, the electronic call alarm on the wall abruptly stopped. The sudden, deafening silence snapped me out of my paralysis. Adrenaline flooded my system. I sprinted down the rest of the hallway, my rubber-soled shoes squeaking loudly on the polished floor. I grabbed the heavy metal handle of room 418 and violently shoved the door open, reaching blindly for the main light switch on the wall. The harsh, white fluorescent lights flickered to life, instantly flooding the room. The room was completely empty. There was no towering shadow. There was no one hiding in the corners. But the temperature inside the room was literally freezing, a thin layer of sparkling white frost completely coating the inside of the window pane. I slowly walked over to the bed. Mr. Callahan was perfectly still. The slow, rhythmic beep of his heart monitor had turned into a solid, continuous, piercing tone. He was gone. But his passing hadn't been peaceful. His eyes were wide open, completely dilated, staring up at the ceiling in absolute, unspeakable horror. His jaw was locked wide open in a silent scream, his frail hands gripping the bedsheets so tightly his knuckles were stark white. Something had been in that room with him. Something had stood directly over his bed in his final moments. I officially called the code, strictly following the hospital protocols. The doctors declared his time of death as 3:18 a.m. I filled out the necessary paperwork, handed in my badge at the end of my shift, and walked out into the freezing Alaskan morning. I never went back to St. Jude's Medical Center. I entirely abandoned my career in nursing that very day, because I know exactly what I saw waiting in the dark at the end of that hallway. And I know for an absolute fact that it is the very last thing we see before we die. The city of Bath, England, is famous for its stunning Georgian architecture and ancient Roman history. My name is Eleanor, and after receiving a modest inheritance, I decided to rent a sprawling first-floor apartment in a crescent built in the late 1700s. The flat was gorgeous, featuring towering ceilings, original crown molding, and massive sash windows that looked out over the rain-slicked cobblestone streets. But the bathroom was a stark contrast to the rest of the airy apartment. It was located deep in the center of the floor plan, completely windowless and eternally cold. Bolted securely to the damp plaster wall above the cast-iron clawfoot tub was a massive, heavily tarnished antique mirror. The silver backing was flaking away at the edges, creating dark, cloudy spots that seemed to absorb the dim bathroom light. The first few days were perfectly fine, but the unsettling events began on a bitterly cold Thursday evening, right in the middle of a torrential downpour. I had drawn a steaming hot bath, hoping to soak the chill from my bones. The thick steam quickly filled the small, windowless room, heavily fogging up the massive antique mirror. I was leaning my head back against the cold porcelain edge of the tub, my eyes closed, when I heard it. It was a sound so incredibly faint, I almost convinced myself it was just the ancient, groaning lead pipes buried inside the walls. But it wasn't a mechanical noise. It was a voice. A soft, wet, desperate whisper, echoing directly behind my head. "Help me." My eyes snapped open. I sat up abruptly, the warm bath water sloshing over the side of the tub onto the hexagonal floor tiles. The small bathroom was completely empty. The only sound was the heavy rain violently lashing against the roof above and the slow, rhythmic dripping of the brass faucet. I stared intensely at the frosted glass of the heavy mirror. The thick layer of condensation was completely undisturbed. I convinced myself I was just exhausted, my mind playing cruel tricks in the echoing space. But the next night, the whisper returned. I was standing at the sink, splashing freezing water onto my face before bed. As I reached blindly for my towel, that same wet, guttural whisper slithered directly into my left ear. "It's so cold." I froze, my hands gripping the edges of the porcelain sink so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. The voice didn't come from the hallway. It didn't come from the ceiling. It came from directly inside the glass. I slowly raised my head, looking at my distorted reflection through the heavy fog of the mirror. I took the dry towel and deliberately wiped a wide circle across the center of the glass. The silver surface was freezing to the touch, far colder than the ambient temperature of the room. As the condensation cleared, I noticed something that made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. There were distinct fingerprints pressed against the glass, but they weren't on the outside. They were pressed into the condensation from behind the mirror, as if someone was trapped inside the dark silver backing, desperately pushing outward. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the opposite wall of the narrow bathroom. I stared at my reflection in the cleared circle of glass. For a terrifying, physically impossible second, my reflection didn't react. I was standing perfectly still, breathing heavily in pure panic, but the woman in the mirror was completely motionless. Her expression was utterly blank. Her eyes were completely dead. Then, a full 2 seconds later, the reflection slowly mimicked my panicked posture, bringing its hands up to its face. A sickening wave of profound dread violently washed over me. I turned off the light switch and practically ran out of the bathroom, securely locking the heavy wooden door behind me. I slept on the living room sofa with all the lights blazing, jumping at every settling creak of the old building. I decided I was going to call the landlord in the morning, break the lease, and move into a modern hotel. But the entity trapped in the glass wasn't going to let me leave that easily.
Around 3 a.m., I was violently jolted awake by a sudden, deafening crash. It sounded exactly like heavy glass shattering, coming directly from the locked bathroom. I grabbed the heavy brass fire poker from the living room hearth, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I slowly crept down the dark hallway, my bare feet completely silent on the hardwood floor. The air grew incredibly freezing the closer I got, and the distinct, sickening smell of stagnant, rotting water seeped out from under the doorframe. I unlocked the heavy door and forcefully pushed it open. The antique mirror wasn't shattered. It was perfectly intact on the wall, but the entire bathroom was completely soaked. Freezing, murky water covered the floor tiles, dripping heavily from the ceiling and running down the plaster walls. The room was suffocatingly cold, and the mirror was completely blacked out by a thick layer of frost. I slowly stepped into the freezing water, my eyes locked onto the massive mirror. As I approached, the frost in the very center of the glass began to melt away, revealing a face. It wasn't my reflection. It was a woman with sickly, pale skin, her lips violently blue, and her wet, dark hair plastered against her hollow cheeks. Her eyes were completely black, void of any white, staring directly into my soul with an ancient, predatory hatred. She raised her sickly, decaying hands, pressing her sharp, multi-jointed fingers violently against the inside of the glass. The heavy, antique mirror began to loudly groan and violently rattle against the wall fixtures, the ancient silver backing bulging outward under her immense pressure. She opened her rotting mouth and let out a deafening,
Waterlogged shriek that completely shattered the overhead light bulb, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the heavy fire poker into the freezing water, turned around, and sprinted out of the apartment. I burst out into the freezing street, wearing nothing but my thin pajamas, completely ignoring the torrential rain. I never went back to that flat. I arranged for a moving company to retrieve my belongings, specifically instructing them to completely ignore the bathroom. I don't know who or what was trapped inside that heavy silver glass, but I know for an absolute fact it is desperately trying to get out. And I never, ever look into antique mirrors anymore.
Driving the desolate stretch of Colorado State Highway 119 in the dead of winter is an exercise in pure, terrifying isolation. My name is Marcus, and I used to drive the graveyard shift for a private car service out of Boulder. Most nights were quiet, just ferrying exhausted airport travelers or late-night shift workers, but the money was good, and I enjoyed the heavy, uninterrupted silence of the mountains. That all changed on a freezing Tuesday night in early February, during one of the worst blizzards of the decade. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, completely burying the reflective lane markers. My heavy SUV was the only vehicle on the road, the headlights cutting a weak yellow tunnel through the endless white. The heater was blasting on full, but the cold still managed to seep through the floorboards. Around 2:15 a.m., the dispatcher radio crackled with a burst of heavy static. It was an odd pickup request. The location was miles off the main highway, near the abandoned silver mining ruins of Nevadaville. There was absolutely nothing out there but collapsed shafts and frozen pine trees. I almost ignored it, but the storm was getting worse, and the thought of someone stranded in sub-zero temperatures gnawed at my conscience. I took the sharp turnoff, my tires crunching heavily over the unplowed, icy gravel. It took 20 agonizing minutes to navigate the winding, treacherous mountain road.
When I finally reached the GPS coordinates, there was no disabled vehicle, no glowing porch lights, just a dilapidated, roofless stone church standing alone in a vast field of deep, unbroken snow. Standing perfectly still beneath the ruined archway was a man. I pulled over, leaving the engine idling loudly in the quiet night, and unlocked the heavy passenger doors. The man moved with a slow, almost mechanical stiffness. As he slid into the back seat, the ambient temperature inside the heated cabin plummeted instantly. I could suddenly see my own breath pluming in the air. He was incredibly tall and painfully thin. He was dressed in a pristine, heavy charcoal suit that looked like it belonged in a 1920s photograph, complete with a wide-brimmed felt fedora pulled low over his eyes. He carried no luggage. He didn't have a phone, and despite standing in a blizzard, there wasn't a single flake of snow on his dark clothes. "Rough night to be out here," I offered, trying to break the suffocating silence. He didn't move his head. "Take me to the canyon," he whispered. His voice was incredibly deep, carrying a strange metallic echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. I put the SUV in drive and slowly made my way back toward the main highway. The silence in the car was physically oppressive. It felt incredibly heavy, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure before a violent thunderstorm. I tried to focus on the icy road, but my eyes kept darting to the rear-view mirror. The man sat perfectly rigid in the center of the back seat. He wasn't breathing. I watched his chest for 5 solid minutes, and it never rose or fell. The sickening smell of ozone, mixed with the unmistakable scent of damp, rotting earth, slowly began to overpower the pine air freshener hanging from my rear-view mirror. "Are you visiting family?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly against my will. The man slowly turned his head toward the mirror. The heavy brim of his hat shifted just enough to reveal the lower half of his face. His skin was the pale, sickly color of old parchment, drawn tightly over his sharp cheekbones. "They are waiting," he rasped. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. The digital clock on the dashboard began to violently glitch, the green numbers flashing erratically before completely dying. The radio suddenly roared to life on its own, blasting a deafening, high-pitched screech of pure static that made me swerve on the black ice. I frantically slammed my hand against the volume dial, but it wouldn't turn off. I glanced up at the rear-view mirror again, completely panicked. The man had removed his hat. Underneath the brim, there were no eyes, just 2 deep, completely hollow, pitch-black sockets that seemed to swallow the weak light of the dashboard. He opened his jaw, unhinging it far wider than any human physically could, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "Stop here." The voice didn't come from his mouth. It echoed directly inside my head, incredibly loud and overwhelmingly powerful. I slammed heavily on the anti-lock brakes. The heavy SUV violently fishtailed across the icy asphalt, coming to a shuddering, violent halt just inches from the rusted steel guardrail overlooking a steep, black ravine. I threw my hands over my head, bracing for the impact of whatever was in the back seat. I squeezed my eyes shut, my chest heaving with sheer terror, waiting for cold hands to grab the back of my neck. But nothing happened. The deafening static on the radio abruptly snapped off. The digital clock flickered back to life. The heavy, oppressive weight in the air instantly vanished, replaced by the normal, blowing heat of the vents. I slowly, agonizingly, turned my head to look over my shoulder.
The back seat was completely empty. The heavy door was still firmly locked from the inside. The windows were rolled up tight. There was absolutely no physical way anyone could have gotten out. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and shined it into the back. The leather seat was completely dry. There was no melting snow, no footprints. But resting perfectly in the dead center of the black leather was a single, heavily tarnished silver dollar. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The date stamped on the worn metal was 1922. I didn't bother checking the ravine.
I slammed the gear shift into drive and practically flew down the mountain, completely ignoring the treacherous ice. I didn't stop driving until I reached the brightly lit, crowded parking lot of a 24-hour diner in Boulder. I quit the car service the very next morning. I still keep that tarnished silver coin locked in a heavy safe in my basement. And I never, ever drive through the mountains after the sun goes down.